Alright, so today I'm going to be talking about Capet, who was king of the Franks in the late ninth century. And while he had quite a short rule and was not necessarily a very effective leader, his reign marked the beginning of a new dynasty whose impact would be lasting. And whose impact would have a great deal of effects for both his family line and the continuation of his family dynasty, as well as lasting impacts for the developing nation of France. Alright, so I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about his earlier life. So, he was born sometime between 938 and 941 to a then Duke of the Franks, Hugh the Great. He was his father's oldest son and was heir to his family's great estates. After the death of his father, Hugh inherited his family's wealth in the form of both power and property in the areas of Paris and Orleans. Both his mother and father were notable figures from prominent families, and he had familial connections to several wealthy and old royal houses that were both French and German. Many members of his family held titles such as Duke, Emperor, King, and so on. He had come from an influential and wealthy family line and was now a threat to powerful rulers such as Lothar of the Carolingian dynasty, who was at this time recognized as the king of the Franks. His threat to Lothar was despite his young age at the time of inheritance. That said, his support at this time was mostly regional, and it was difficult for him to try and extend his influence without being drawn into conflict with the neighboring powers. His marriage to Adelaide, daughter of the Duke of Aquitaine, was an attempt at this, but one that ended up rather unsuccessful. He was, however, later able to ally with German rulers such as Otto II and III, who helped him to further his political interests against Lothar. It was during this time that he began to take on a more king-like role and king-like duties, and he eventually reached a point where he was essentially performing all of the duties of the king, but lacking the title. Yet he would get his title eventually, as after Lothar's death, his son Louis V ruled for a short time, and then he would be elected King of the Franks. Alright, so next I'm going to talk a little bit about his path towards kingship. So, Louis V died shortly after becoming king, and he had no sons to inherit his throne. There was, however, another member of the Carolingian dynasty, Charles of Lorraine, who was eligible to have succeeded him. This being said, his efforts to make himself a valuable candidate had succeeded, and there were many in support of him taking the throne rather than Charles. He spun the narrative that Charles was not fit to rule, and that the role should be elected, not hereditary, so not passed down through sons. His campaign was successful, and he was crowned King of the Franks in Paris in the early summer of 987. Some sources claim that he attempted to secure his son's role as successor early on in his rule, helping to solidify the family dynasty. But this would have been a controversial early move, as his family line were not members of the Carolingian dynasty, and this would shift the patriarchal power of the role. Alright, so next I'm going to discuss a little bit about Hugh's reign. So, Hugh's transition to power was made difficult by the persistent agitation of Charles for reconsideration of the election. He had some support, namely in the form of those in or supporting the Carolingian dynasty. Hugh did make some efforts to try and improve his relations with the Carolingian dynasty during this time, but Charles was very persistent in his opposition. Using the support he had gained, Charles was able to capture the area of Lyon and take, which was a significant part of the Carolingian royalty. And Hugh and his son attempted to besiege the city, but they were unable to do this and had to withdraw multiple times. and Hugh became unsure that they were going to be able to accomplish this because he thought that perhaps they just didn't have the military power to win using force. But the Bishop of Lyon, who was named Aldebaran, was obviously upset that he was forced out of the city by Charles, so he wanted to bring peace between Charles and Hugh. But the peace didn't exactly work out very well, so he ended up capturing Charles and bringing him to Hugh. Ultimately, after a great deal of conflict between the two, Charles was captured and brought to Hugh, who imprisoned him in Orleans. Charles remained in prison until his death. Charles was not the only person to move against Hugh during his reign. There is some evidence of a plot involving the Bishop of Lyon and Count of Blois to capture Hugh and possibly his son and bring them to Otto III. But this plot was unsuccessful, and there is no historical evidence that Hugh took any action to reprimand or fight back against either of these men. This could suggest that his hold on power was so weak that he could not afford to make any drastic political moves. This appears to be a theme throughout the entirety of his relatively short reign. And despite this, his enemies were never able to launch a successful conspiracy plot in his lifetime, and he held on to his power until death. Alright, so next I'm going to talk a little bit about his later life to death. So, Hugh would continue to struggle to hold up against the local vassals, bishops, and counts from around the borders of the rivers Seine and Loire. And he had limited access to a military, and often he had to outsource military aid from others, such as Richard I of Normandy. In October of 996, Hugh died, and his son Richard II took over the throne. This transition was relatively smooth because, as was already mentioned, Hugh had made his son his successor right after he himself was elected king. Hugh's securing of this role for both himself and his descendants marked the beginning of the Capet dynasty, and his family line would remain in power for hundreds of years and several generations following his death. To finish up, I'm going to talk a little bit about Hugh's legacy. So, his legacy lies not in what he accomplished during his rule, which, albeit, was not much, but in what it meant for the House of Capet in the greater kingdom of France. Following his coronation, the House of Capet would rule uninterrupted for over 300 years. The direct line would rule until 1328 and would then be broken by the three sons of Philip IV who had no male heirs. And even after this, it was still kept within branches of the Capet dynasty on and off. There were other branches of the Capet dynasty, such as the House of Bourbon, that would keep the power connected to Hugh and his legacy. This passing of power would only ever really be broken up by the Emperor Napoleon, who ruled for a 10-year period. So, this meant that his family directly held royal power in France for the next several generations. In this time, Hugh's family line would have had a significant impact on the development of the French nation. He is credited with helping to establish the exact geographical location of modern-day France, which is rather different than how the kingdom of the Franks would have been broken up at the time he had power. And also, his power was centered in the area of Paris, which would go on to house the central power of France for hundreds of years, eventually becoming the capital city of the nation as it is today. So, overall, while Hugh himself may not have done anything significant during his time as king, he was the catalyst for his dynasty that would rule for hundreds of years to follow, and have a significant impact on the modern-day nation of France.